Thank you for being here. I apologize for not being here when you first got here to give you a warm welcome, and so this is kind of a goodbye instead of a welcome. It's great to be here, and I tell you, it was great to spend some time with your mayor at the various mayor's conferences I've had. But it's great to see you, and thank you for coming here. I've learned, I knew it before, but I didn't quite feel it in my bones the way I feel it now, how much cities can learn from each other. And how much in these changing times, cities are the front lines, both in where our challenges show up and where the opportunities to find solutions to those challenges are. I will give myself away. I have given up on any solutions coming from Washington, D.C. I think for the next 2 to how many years, we're going to be fending off D.C. as cities and trying to do progressive things. I know that you are in the hunt for HQ2. I'm sure we'll get some questions about that. I want you to know I'm opposed to it. I don't think there should be an HQ2. I think BO1 would be fine, Branch Office 1. But in seriousness, I think it's great that you're here because we in Seattle really are at that front line of what happens in these changing times to cities and to populations and the people living in them in these incredibly fluctuous times. I think we are living in a period of time that history will write is more displacing than the Industrial Revolution. And that the new technology economy is leading people behind at such a rapid pace it is impossible almost to keep up. And you see it where cities are where people are moving and living and where change is happening. But with that is coming all of the displacing and challenges to our social justice framework that we already felt as a society. Here in Seattle, we talk about the tale of two cities, where we have a city that has an amazingly strong and vibrant economy, where we have Amazon with 50,000 workers who come literally from all over the world and have driven a very high-level arts and culture, restaurants, you name it, Seattle's happening. But at the same time, Seattle is facing a crisis of affordability. People can't afford to live in Seattle anymore. And having grown up that, I can tell you that the people who've lived here sometimes for generations don't know whether they can stay in their homes if they are lucky enough to have homes because property taxes have risen so high. And their kids probably can't afford to live in Seattle. We are really losing our middle class rapidly. And so that's the challenge of a mayor, is that what do we do when those neighborhoods who have been traditionally communities of color, where really the black community in the city was able to etch out vibrant, arts and commercial and neighborhoods have been pushed out at such a rapid pace. How do we stop that kind of gentrification that can have such a negative, displacing thing? And how do we close that opportunity gap between those who have grown up here but have been locked out of the opportunities and those who have the opportunities and many of whom have moved here? I believe as mayor that we have a separate education system, that education is going to be a critical component of that. We have on our ballot this November, Families and Education, Preschool, and Promise Levy. We've always, the city has supplemented our education since the 1990s. That levy expired, as did our preschool. If it passes, we will almost double the number of free preschool slots, which will go primarily to families that don't have the ability to pay for good quality pre-K. And I will tell you, the data is so clear that if kids show up ready to learn in school, they do better. I mean, it seems obvious. Then we're going to take some monies and really try to close that opportunity gap, because in Seattle it's shown up very clearly that kids of color are falling behind, particularly African Americans and Native Americans. And the gap is getting wider, not smaller. So how do we close that? So we were going to reprogram some of that health, wraparound services, homeless services, really fund those needs for our students. And then for those kids that do what we ask of them, we're going to return that promise with 2 years free college. And every kid who graduates. But not just the tuition program, because we know that doesn't work. We're going to make sure that the schools work with them, the counselors, get them ready, get them pointed, get their families ready, help them fill out the forms, and when they land in the colleges, have that same landing spot. And then, if we do it right, we will also join it up with the next phase, which is good apprenticeship programs for kids starting in middle school, going through high school, so that when they graduate from those 2-year college, they not only have experience on their resume, they have the ability to do these next generation jobs that are good family wage jobs. And startling statistics, Seattle and Washington State, enormously progressive in some ways. But it's estimated that we will probably create over 700,000 jobs in the next 5 years in the Puget Sound region. 700,000 jobs, think of that. Most of them really good family wage jobs, but most of them require some post-high school college education certificate or training. Only 30% of our kids are getting it. So we're telling 70% of our kids, those jobs of the future, not yours. So we're trying to change that, and at the same time trying to figure out what are those things we can do to address people experiencing homelessness, to build affordable housing as quickly as we can, to really make sure that that job opportunities, whether it is working at the port or being a coder, can really be available to more. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that I think cities are in a unique position to really address, because populations are moving to cities. It's where the problems and the opportunities show up first. And here in Seattle, we're lucky, and I think it's a lot of Philadelphia. We got a population that's really on the main committed to doing the right thing. They want help. So how do we channel that? How does the city, what is our regulation structure, our tax structure? How do we work with our nonprofits and our businesses to create a fabric? It's not always easy. Well, if it was easy, it'd be Portland. Anyway, I know you want to get to the panel. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to the panel.
Thank you, Mayor Durkan. My name is David Boardman. Met many of you over these 3 days. I'm the Dean of the Pine College Media and Communication at Temple University, and I'm also the chair of the Lenfest Institute for Journalism, which owns the Inquirer and the Daily News. I'm delighted to be moderating the last session of these exciting 3 days. This particular GPLEX, which is my first, has been an amazing and surreal experience for me. Because it really brought together two parts of my life. Before coming to Temple 5 years ago, I had spent my entire adult life here in Western Washington. 30 years of that working for the Seattle Times, and much of the last decade as the top editor of the newspaper. So it's been a remarkable experience to see my beloved old city through the eyes of my beloved new city. As you've seen, the streets here are much cleaner than ours in Philly. The sushi is fresher. And yes, the pedestrians are more obedient. But they can't touch our cannolis. They don't have the farms. There's not a Wawa within 2,700 miles. And they don't have the Vince Lombardi trophy. And even though they're getting an NHL team, in large part thanks to Mayor Durkan, they don't have Brady. But despite these and other obvious differences, we really have seen, I think, in both these cities, a tremendous civic pride and a passion for social justice that isn't in every city in America, and it certainly is strong in these two cities. There are two other attributes that our cities share: outstanding journalism and dynamic mayors. These three people on the stage today represent those attributes. I will come clean that they're all my friends. Two are journalists, one with whom I worked very closely for a couple of decades, and the other with whom I competed against. The third, the mayor, is, I'll also come clean on this, a beloved pal of more than 25 years. And I don't know, it's been an interesting thing for me to even ponder how I would have been the editor of the Seattle Times if she were the mayor. One or the other. Yeah, we probably wouldn't be friends anymore. It worked out okay. So let me say a little bit more about what we're going to do here. For this session, I'm asking my journalist friends to participate not in their usual roles as questioners, but really much more as observers, longtime observers of the city, residents of the city, experts on the city and the region. And I'll say a little bit more about them. Michelle Matassa Flores is the managing editor of the Seattle Times, where she's worked for 25 years. In that role, she's the second in command in the news department and really is the point person for much of the newspaper's coverage day to day. She's held a variety of roles there in reporting and editing, and she happens to love Philadelphia, which she's visited several times in the last few years. Knut Berger, or Skip as his friends know him, is a Seattle institution. He's a lifelong Seattleite, which is a rare bird in these parts. We have two of them, and writes about the city with an eye that's both reverential and critical. His work appears in a variety of venues and formats, the online journal Crosscut.com, public television, and Seattle Magazine. And he's the author of two books, one of which is particularly relevant to this discussion. The title is Pugitopolis, a Mossback Takes on Growth Addicts, Weather Wimps, and the Myth of Seattle Nice. And finally, a couple more words about Mayor Jenny Durkan, words that I would never say about her in public if I were the editor of the Seattle Sun. I first met her back in 1989. I was a young and aspiring journalist. She was a young and aspiring lawyer. We were thrown together on a story that we were both too young and too idealistic to understand was the kind of story that would never be published. She was representing a 23-year-old woman who claimed to have been drugged and raped at the home of a very prominent man. And in this case, torn right from today's headlines, this prominent man was not a Hollywood producer or America's dad. He was a member of the United States Senate. Spurred on by Jenny's determination and her integrity, it took 3 reporters and myself more than 3 years to find and tell the stories of a dozen other victims of this senator, whose name was Brock Adams. We were finally able to publish the story in 1992, and he immediately dropped out of the race for re-election, never to be heard from again. I think that reporting, we like to think, was a brick in the foundation of today's Me Too movement, and I will tell you, it would not have happened except for Jenny Durkan. In the decades since, I've watched her take on a series of similarly daunting challenges in private practice, as chief counsel for the governor of Washington, as a citizen reformer on the Seattle Police Commission, as you heard, U.S. Attorney for the state of, for Western Washington, a role in which she shined as a champion for civil rights, which was a particularly fitting achievement for the first openly gay U.S. Attorney in American history. She's been the mayor for 10 months. She's been more than a little busy in that role, so we're really thankful to have this chunk of her time. Your GPLEX agenda says this session is about what's next for Seattle. We've decided to make it more about Seattle's past, its present, its future, and including how the city can leverage these breathtaking strengths you've seen and heard about while managing some of the gargantuan challenges that you've also heard about, and to consider what all of that means, what lessons are in it, good and bad, inspiring and cautionary for us in Philadelphia. So Mayor Durkan and Skip both grew up in what people around here call Old Seattle. We heard her already refer to that. Skip, let's start with you because you are a historian. Tell us what was different in Old Seattle and what's been lost and what's been gained with this new Seattle.
Well, thanks for having me. This is fun to get to talk about my favorite subject, which is Seattle and where it came from and where it's going, and trying to navigate the present, which is rapidly changing. There's sort of 2 levels to talk about this on. I mean, when people refer to Old Seattle, I think it was a smaller town, it was a provincial port city. I remember traveling, doing a road trip to Philadelphia, actually. In 1971, I was 16 years old and I had a Jeep. At every gas station I stopped at, the gas station attendant would look at the license plate and his eyes would get wide. And he'd say, "Where are you from?" I'd say, "Seattle." And he'd say, "Oh, I was there during World War II on my way to the Pacific. It rains all the time." And that was kind of all we were known for. I think those of us who grew up in that Seattle, while it had problems, segregation and other issues, it was also a town that you could afford to live in. It was a place where your kids could afford to live in. And I think one of the other aspects of Old Seattle, certainly of the 1950s and 60s, was it had a civic presence in terms of columnists and civic debate that tried to pop the city's bubble as much as possible. We had a movement here called Lesser Seattle. People wanted it to stay small. They wanted it to stay a reigning secret. They wanted it to be a little mediocre.
You live right at that point of tension, at that intersection, both professionally and personally. I mean, I know how much you love this place and you love everything it has been and what it stood for, and it's your job to help manage where it's going. So talk about that, and how can you retain those things that all four of us love about this place and take it where it needs to
Yeah,
go?
it's such a great question. It's interesting because I can remember when I was running for office last year, I was in one of the almost 100 candidate debates I went to, and one of the questions was about change. And so I said, so how many people in the room, if you could do it today, would just stop the growth in Seattle? Stop it for 10 years, let us get our bearings, just stop it. Almost every single hand in the room goes up. And I said, okay, now I want you to keep that hand up if you were born here. You know, almost every hand went down. So there's always this tension, I think, in human, development of when you get there, it's your place, and how do you control that place? And I tell you, I grew up in this city and saw all the changes, and that is kind of what Seattle has been since its history. We literally burned down. We had the gold rush and the bust. In the 1970s, I was here when we had the Boeing bust, and literally overnight, the city emptied out. I can remember riding around this one little neighborhood near where we lived. We lived not in Seattle, but out in the country. And houses where my friends had lived were empty, vacant houses with weeds growing up. And it took a long time for us to get back. So we have been this boom and bust place. But at its core, I think you're right. Seattle's this place that has to be thinking about not just how do we fix today and make it equitable and just, because we've always been this place too. I think that everybody is a common person, and anyone who thinks they're not gets put in their place really quickly. And so how do we keep that equity but make it real, fix the really, really vast inequities we have, but build for that next generation, both infrastructure-wise and what the city looks like in 10 and 15 and 20 years. And history doesn't stand still. And we're at that moment in time where jobs are being displaced, workers are going to be displaced. Jobs that exist today will not exist in 10 years. And some of them have the jobs of the people who can afford to lose the jobs the least. I'll give you one more example and then I'll let you ask someone else, but another thing came up during the campaign about, the union representing grocery workers sat down with the candidates and wanted them to sign a pledge that a particular company that was moving here was not union, and would you promise to hold them to have union jobs? And I said, you're asking the wrong question, because in 5 years, there'll be no clerks. What are you doing on that as a policy? And now you see it, Amazon Go, there's 2 of them in the city, they've announced thousands more. We've got to keep up as policymakers to be thinking about when we have automated vehicles, thousands of people in Seattle will lose their jobs almost overnight. And they are predominantly people of color, immigrants, and refugees in some of the sectors. And we have no plans to replace those jobs for people. So these discussions about technology have to have a reflection of the people that are underlying it. And I think that's the discussion we've had. We talk about change and traffic's hard to get here and it's not the city it used to be. But how do we make sure the people who live there, they have a plan that can be, there's a future in this city for them.
Michelle, this group has heard a lot this week about what seems to be a nirvana of cooperation and collaboration. A virtual sound garden where there are no 9-inch nails around and everybody gets along and works together. Labor and business, city and suburban officials, housing advocates, transit advocates. It certainly doesn't sound like the Seattle I left. Is this the one you know now?
I hate the word, you're taking my, thank you.
I hate the word guffaw, but when you mentioned this to me earlier today, that's exactly what I do not think that is true. All respect to the mayor. I think Seattle has long been a place where process gets in the way of getting things done quickly. As a proud jaywalker, I like going to the East Coast. I get an energy from people who are just going to get where they're going quickly and not let anything get in their way. Seattle is very much that stand on the street corner kind of place when it comes to getting things done. And I think, you know, I don't know how much you've heard about issues in the news this week versus that bigger picture, but we recently had a failed attempt to come up with an employee head tax to fund affordable housing. And I think one reason it may have failed is that people were caught off guard by that plan, and many of the people who were caught off guard were business people in Seattle. And I think at least for the public that we hear from at the Seattle Times, our readers, and this is through still phone calls and emails and tweets and texts and all kinds of ways, comments on our stories. I think there was a realization then that, oh, people aren't talking to each other to solve these problems. There's still something missing there. I think there are some very sincere efforts to change that. And in fact, there's a large coordinating group called One Table here to try to come up with solutions to our homelessness crisis. But we're not there yet. We're far from there.
Skip, what do you think?
Can I tell you a funny story real first?
Oh, yeah.
So all of you saw Jeff Flake get confronted in the elevator by the two women.
Yeah.
And Mitch Landrieu, who was the mayor of New Orleans, had the funniest thing he said. Yeah, that looked pretty rough for a U.S. Senator, but if you're mayor, that happens 7 times while you're buying milk. That's Seattle.
Yeah, well, there's people have talked about Seattle process and a process of inclusion and discuss it. I think there's a sense that we can talk things to death, study things to death. I think there's also currently kind of a perception that that the city council in particular kind of lives in an extreme liberal bubble or identity politics bubble. You hear a lot of people who are frustrated with some of the practicalities and we used to be, interestingly, like just with in the late 60s and early 70s, the urbanist reform movement was driven by Republicans in Seattle. Now you'd be hard-pressed to find a Republican in Seattle. We become, well, I was going to say a one-party town, but we're really a two-party town, Democrats and socialists. And I think that the pressures that come from the activists, we've had that practically since the beginning, that's nothing new. But I think there's a sense on the part of a lot of voters that it's created a certain amount of dysfunction, as well as backlash from people labeled as NIMBYs who are concerned about homeless moving into their neighborhoods and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of tension in our politics. We have city council elections coming up in 2019. I think it'll be a pretty interesting election.
Now, Mayor Durkan, I know you do have a different perspective on the collaborative process here, as you had shared with me. Say a little bit.
No, I think that we are, but I think our politics reflects where we are as a country and a city. It's a fraught time in many ways. And the proximity that you have in a city, you see those inequities up close every day. And those friction points are just more dramatic. It's funny because you talk about Seattle process, and we do. It's like I tell people, it's kind of like, anyone who's had a kid or grandkid, and they've got those teething biscuits, by the time they're done, they're just mush. That's kind of how we do policy in Seattle sometimes. It's like we chew on it. But I tell you, if you try to speed things up, that's the first criticism. You didn't call this person, you didn't do this, we weren't ready, we didn't know. And even from the business community who will say, why did you do X? That was such a disaster. But if you look at any of our successful businesses in Seattle, and I say to them, well, didn't you have a phone that you spent hundreds of millions of dollars on and abandoned overnight, or Tivana, or you can go down? Companies are expected to fail fast. If government does that, there's a whiplash factor that people can't navigate in the same way. So there's this balance between being the continuity that people need and having those basic city services, but being able to be innovative enough that sometimes you try things and they're not going to work. And you try to get everyone in a room, but you're never going to get 100% agreement. And sometimes you just got to try things. So I think I think we probably have more rooms with more people in them than a lot of cities over and over again. But at the same time, I think what you're seeing now is we the resistance you get is when you try to move a little more quickly.
So certainly, this group has offered lots of compliments about Seattle this week.
We can stop now.
But we heard a comment yesterday from somebody that resonated pretty loudly with the room, which is, where are all the black and brown people? And certainly while most of America has diversified dramatically over the past couple of decades, Seattle barely has, and in fact, its historical black neighborhood in the central area I read, which 10 years ago even was like 70% black, is now 16, 17% black. Michelle, what are the implications of Seattle to some extent becoming like Paris, where all the people of color are being pushed out to Kent, or not all of them, but many of them?
Well, I think there's a blandness that takes over. First of all, it's a lot less interesting a place. I think there's a very, and this is really probably my top concern about this place right now, that it's becoming so divided economically, culturally, socioeconomically, and people are left out. It's like the mayor was talking about, jobs aren't, these jobs aren't yours, they're somebody else's. Having people left behind is going to lead to just a sameness of decisions being made, catering to the wealthy. We've got, in the schools, for instance, a lot of not even the extracurriculars, but in some cases, basic education functions are sometimes paid for by PTAs at individual schools. And in wealthier neighborhoods, they get better stuff. They get new books, they get music classes that schools in poorer neighborhoods don't get. Over time, it's going to be more and more pronounced. And this isn't just Seattle, I think our country. Seattle's a reflection in many ways of what's going on nationally. People will continue to be left behind. And I think, I'm not sure what this city can do to stop that, but right now it's not heading in a positive place. You've got people of color are moving. When they leave the central district in Seattle, they're going out to the suburbs and the exurbs in King County. It takes them a lot longer to get to work. They're working 2 and 3 jobs and not being with their families, and it's going to lead to just a greater and greater divide economically.
Mayor Durkan, as you mentioned, Philly is on the list of finalists for Amazon HQ2. There are many people in this room who are salivating at the prospect. There are others, particularly after this week, who have a little be careful what you wish for. What would your advice be, both in terms of if the city, I think against pretty high odds, but if the city were to get HQ2 in dealing with Amazon, and then just the general sense of how to attract more significant employers to Philadelphia?
I think it is really that it's difficult for cities. I would say, in the main, you want to be part of the city that is attracting the jobs. When I was U.S. Attorney, I was really fortunate. I got to be friends with a number of the U.S. attorneys in the country, and 2 of my closest friends, one was U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, and the other was the U.S. Attorney in Detroit. And if you go to Newark and Detroit, those are the cities that Seattle didn't want to be because they just couldn't make that transition. But the reverse is true too. If you're not super intentional about it and don't look at cities, I would say if you get HQ2, if you're lucky enough to do it, send someone here. We will put together a delegation to say, here's works of the wise of things. If we had known up front how quickly Amazon was going to grow, things we would have built in advance. Everything from social infrastructure to housing costs, to education, to those things that if you don't have those bulwarks, you get what Michelle says, which is pretty soon you've had this growth come down on top of the city and just push people out. And so if you don't have that opportunity flow growing from the ground up at the same time to meet it, then you're only going to at some point lead to the disparities, if not in your own city, being pushed to the perimeters of the city. So I think that there's public safety, there's social justice, there's education, there's opportunity. How do you look at what are those feeder jobs to get to those great new jobs that are coming? Because jobs do create, attract jobs. With Amazon, Facebook is growing here really quickly. Google's growing here quickly. Apple's growing here quickly. We had Microsoft. But those jobs tend to be of you know, in the main, a certain type of job that are not the jobs that are open up to a lot of the kids that are going through our school system and dropping out. And so how do we go to the businesses and say, tell us the jobs you're going to be needing for the next 5 and 10 years, and then create the curriculum in the schools to match it, and the jobs to match the curriculum, and that's where the business community rallies around together with everyone else to say, okay, we all know this is going to benefit us. Then you got to have for the people already through the schools who don't have those opportunities. What's the strategy for that?
Skip, how do the Mossbacks feel about Amazon?
Amazon is probably the most hated company in town, partly because of this. It's sort of a lot of young people hate it because of the income inequality that it has represented. You have, tons of jobs being created in Seattle filled with single young people making $100,000, $200,000 a year. And as the mayor said, Seattle wasn't prepared for this. Old Seattle was a city of modest bungalows that had been built over a 70-year period, single-family homes, low-density neighborhoods. These used to be starter homes, and now they sell for $1 million. So it's I think it's, Amazon's been criticized for what it's done to bookstores. It's been criticized for not being socially engaged enough in Seattle. And so I think it has come to represent sort of the big bad of corporate for a lot of people. For a lot of other people, well, they work there. And they like the company and the prosperity. I would just agree with what the mayor said in terms of if you get Amazon, there is a cost to the prosperity and the issues of equity in terms of how that prosperity is shared. And I think, the head tax that the city tried to impose on Amazon was an attempt to get large employers to step up and help with that equity issue by using that money to create affordable housing and to help homeless. I think there's if you go up on Capitol Hill and look at the polls in neighborhoods or in the South End, you'll see a lot of anti-Amazon signs depending on what issue is hot.
I just want to challenge that a little bit. I think you're right, Skip, in some ways, but I think it's a little rosy glasses to say inequity wasn't here before. It was just more visible. And because the city grew so fast, it became so pronounced and we couldn't avoid it anymore. I mean, before we had, lots of flop houses and people living in abandoned houses and a lot of homeless people, and proportionately on the population, it probably wasn't that different than today. The difference is we have no place now for people experiencing homelessness to be. There is no affordable housing. So I agree with you that it's become the banner, but I think it's too easy for us to say that's the cause. We're not going to stop growth in technology in America. And we are changing so rapidly as a country that if we don't figure out the solutions, then we're going to be constantly retrofitting ourselves as cities and as a country to try to back up. And so I agree with you that it's in many quarters the emblem and on the banner of this is why things are bad. But I think that we had a lot of entrenched inequalities in Seattle before Amazon opened shop.
I think you're not wrong, but I think the ceiling has gotten a lot higher. There's a lot more wealth here and a lot more, I think, ostentatious wealth. Not that that's a bad thing. When Microsoft grew here, it grew more slowly. It was, I think, thought to be more of this place. The founder was a Seattle guy. Many of the people it hired, because it grew slower, were from around here. And they were given stock options, not huge salaries in the beginning or big signing bonuses, so they were much more, their wealth grew more organically or something. I covered Microsoft in the mid-90s, and you go out to the parking lot there, and the hot new car, the show of wealth was a jet. And now there, you see Maseratis. In South Lake Union, the Seattle Times is next door to the headquarters of Amazon. Our old building was torn down to make way for more of that. And I'm bitter. And I'm really not. I think that neighborhood in many ways is a better neighborhood than it used to be before Amazon landed there. But the flash and the wealth that you see, it's very much not of this place. And I think that people are just, their heads are still spinning about that. And I think that will probably happen wherever they put HQ2.
So I want to leave time for some of your questions. I don't know, is there a microphone out there yet? Okay, so raise your hand and then I'll ask one while they're taking it around. So several of my GPLEX colleagues dragged me last night to one of the city's fine dispensaries. Actually, I dragged them. What impact?
One of you so mellow.
What impact has marijuana legalization had on the city, do you think? And start with the mayor.
That's a really good question. I think that it has been, I would be honest, I was U.S. attorney when it was becoming legalized, and I was very, very skeptical that you could stand up a legal marijuana system next to the black market system. It hasn't been perfect, but I think it has done better than they have, and I think that this has shown to the rest of the country. Most cities now, and in most states, most of the population is living somewhere where marijuana is legal in some form, either medicinal or otherwise. And I think what it has shown is you can have a system in place that can basically control and regulate marijuana in a way that is better than the old system.
Skip the other thought on that.
I think the impact culturally has been almost zero, except they're more happy-looking people at bus stops.
All right, who had a question?
What the heck, So a couple things about the workforce and what you can do about that. So are you working with these big companies and maybe with government about who supplies these companies, right? Because not everybody in an office building is a tech worker, right? So the facilities maintenance, where they're getting, I'm sure there's like a hotel industry where they're getting their sheets and their towels and all of that. So is there a concerted effort within the city to go to these major companies and employers and even city government about saying, is there anything we can do with our vendor and supplier business in order to promote, kind of jobs or a different level of workforce based on all the support that's needed? And I would like to get a better understanding. I kind of asked this question of the transportation people yesterday, but, at what point is the sort of that top level techie class going to realize, oh my God, I can't get any of the support services I would like to have, in my sort of ideal community because no one's going to travel 2 hours to make $15 an hour. So just in general, are you kind of looking at those kinds of things as far as workforce development?
Great question, and yes, and I think we have to, because Michelle brought this up, is if you look now, partly because of displacement and largely because of cost, the people who earn the less can't live in Seattle by and large. And so they're traveling the furthest, sometimes for 1 or 2 jobs. Often transit doesn't go from where they're living to Seattle, or not at the times they need to go. So we're having this very holistic conversations on how do we address just that. And it's the whole supplier chain through everything else, and talking to companies so that they'll have more cognizance. I think it was a really good thing that Amazon announced that everyone's going to get $15 an hour. But I think we have to have holistic systems that look at, both how do we create jobs in communities around Seattle, how do we pay people more, how do we have better transit, and how do we make sure that we're not just ending up with a very wealthy class and service workers. And that's, and how do we make sure we have that, just not the workers, but where those workers can live in Seattle.
Question here?
Yeah, hi, Chris Policy from the Phillies Office of Transportation and Infrastructure. It seems we heard a lot of great...
We're looking for a new head of our Seattle department. We can talk later.
It's nice here. So, we heard lots of great stories about, ST1, ST2, ST3, in order to get people where they need to go, but, you've got this huge housing problem, and how much of the solution to that affordable housing problem is, just having that fight to upzone that 70% that's low density residential, and then letting the market, take it the rest of the way to build more housing in the city, and how much is other slightly less, government sets the thing and then steps back, and how much is it like government really directly gets involved to build, just the masses, oodles of affordable housing that's needed.
So I think, and they may have comments too, I think it's all of the above. First of all, it's not a Seattle problem, it's a statewide problem. And I've had conversations, national problem, thank you. We've had conversations, we're trying to lay the framework to have a housing production effort on the scale of Sound Transit 3. To say, if we are really gonna be that community where people are gonna be able to live and work, we've got to do it big, and Seattle can't do it alone. So how do we make sure that that's the next big push in this region, is build affordable housing? And not just poor housing, the lowest, but also that middle class housing that is just diminishing so rapidly that there's nowhere for people to have if they want home ownership. The second thing is, and zoning is always this like, God, if we just upzone single family. So people often quote, 70% of the city is locked up in single family housing. Actually not true. If you take out the parks and the roads in Seattle, about 33% of the land is in single family. And a good portion of that, at the fringes, actually has grandfathered in duplexes and stuff. So what my approach is, let's try to do what people want upzone first in single family, which is mother-in-laws and backyard cottages as quickly as we can, so that pretty much every lot could be turned into a triplex. And at the same time, build as much multifamily as we can, as quickly as we can, and have formulas for home ownership as well. We are working right now to stand up a middle-class housing advisory committee, working and then going to the Rockefeller Family Foundation and Kresge Family Foundation is going to have an effort in opportunity zones. I don't know if Philadelphia's got any of those approved, but get them ready, because there's going to be Wall Street coming to the table with money, and I think that's going to help cities.
I want to ask a somewhat self-interested question. While the city and region is in this spectacular boom, one of its most important institutions, journalism, is to some degree in a tailspin here and around the country. How does that matter? What are the challenges of that, for journalists, as there's so much more to cover and so many fewer people to do it? I'll start with Michelle.
Yes. All of that. At the Seattle Times, we remain proud of the journalism we're producing, in spite of all the challenges facing our industry. But our newsroom is a third to a half the size of what it was in the late 90s. The Capitol Bureau in Olympia is its most worrisome is the cutbacks in cultural coverage. I think we are, in spite of that, very focused on a few subjects in particular where we really dive deep, and it's all about informing the public and shining a light on what's going on, calling out inaction or lack of coordination, giving voice to all types of people so that they can be heard when these important decisions are being made. I think the requirements of us have never been greater.
And I'll say, and that is a newspaper that's been owned by the same family for 122 years and really dedicated to quality. So you can imagine it's much worse at a lot of other places around the country. I want to use the opportunity to underscore for all of you how enormously blessed we are in Philadelphia with Jerry Lenfest's generosity and the situation in Philadelphia where the Inquirer staff is actually growing. And I think you'll all agree.
And that's the Philadelphia Inquirer, right? Not the National Inquirer.
The Philadelphia Inquirer, and where we're actually seeing advancement. So time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Anna Liu. I'm with WHO West Pine Philly, so we're the public media station, and then Pine Philly focuses on Philadelphia's neighborhoods. David, you took part of my question, so I will rephrase mine. My question, I think now is a little bit about the role of local journalism, since Seattle's in the national and international spotlight so much, and with news desks and newsrooms being sort of cut by half and by a third, if what is going on in Seattle, if you're writing in part for a national audience, how can you continue, and the fear of losing what's local, both the local population, the local culture, and everything else, how do you speak to the folks who already feel like they're not being heard or not being represented, while at the same time, watching as New York Daily News their newsroom is getting cut in half, the Metro desk at the Washington Post is close to non-existent because there's so much attention on what's national. How do you balance that when you know that at the national level people are watching Seattle and other cities want to know how Seattle is handling things so that they can learn lessons? How do you local?
Sure. Well, I'm in the public media business also. Crosscut is a nonprofit website. We're 11 years old. I think we're the oldest media startup. In the sense that
Frank Bluffman calls us a media startup.
Yeah, I think every news organization has to be a continual startup because things are changing. We're affiliated with a public television station, KCTS 9, and so which has both kind of web and television. Our approach is to partner and work with other media organizations. To take advantage of everyone's strengths. We've done projects with the Seattle Times. We've done things with KUOW, which is the NPR station in town. So we look for partnering. Our newsroom is growing. It's also diversifying, which is a real effort that we're making to be able to get more perspectives on Crosscut. We're still kind of reading oriented. And I think that there's a lot of room for improvement in things like TV coverage and whatnot, because I think the local broadcast stations have suffered, declines and also very low ratings. People are tuning out broadcasts; they're getting their news in other ways. So. We also reach out through social media in ways, I think, to try and diversify. And we cover what we think are the major stories that are Seattle-based that affect the region and to some degree the country. We cover Amazon, regularly. We cover, we look at the national implications of other stories. The mayor's been instrumental in this private development of an old arena here in Seattle, so we're going to get a hockey team and hopefully an NBA team pretty soon. But it's all private investment. It's $700 million of private money going into this project, which I think reverses the old idea that the public needs to subsidize billionaires as opposed to the other way around.
Michelle, you wanted to say?
If I could just add really quickly, I know we're kind of tight on time, but I think our approach has been to write about local issues with national context. Homelessness is a great example of that, where we're actually traveling around the country and finding solutions or things that seem to be working or taking hold elsewhere, and then to write about national issues from a local viewpoint. Immigration is a great example of that. So part of that is to bring people together toward the middle, and that can be geographic, it can be political, it can be economic, and it can, I tell our reporters, don't go for extreme sound bites, find the people, the moderates in the middle who will get us somewhere. So I think, in terms of being a local news organization, that's what we can do to add to the.
So I want to respect the need for many of you to catch planes, but I want to give the mayor the last word and anything you want to say to the Philadelphia visitors.
So one is thank you for coming. Two, go do good. And I just want to follow up on this. I don't think there's been any more important time, and we say this all the time, but I just think we're at this pivotal time in our country. And I think that the press is crucial to making sure that we have transparency and honesty moving forward. And it's really hard right now because I think we're at this time where it is, clicks are king, snark is king, hot takes are king. And to be able to have those journalists who can actually take the time to develop sources, to go out and ask questions, to do thoughtful pieces, is not always rewarded. And it's not that the parts, I can tell you, we take a fair amount of hits. And if they're good, clean hits, it's good. I mean, it's never good, but it's fair. But it's good for society. But I would say, don't just, it's so right now, I would say that journalism is having a really hard time finding its footing. And if you look at the national level, the president drives every news cycle by the tweet he does in the morning. And then you have three talking heads who yell at each other all day long. And in the meantime, some really important issues are happening in every city around the world. I mean, there's still a war in Syria, folks. There's famine in Africa. There's all these things that are going on that's really hard to get attention. So as you're a policymaker, then you start to, your government moves to that, and you don't want it to. You want us to be thoughtful. You want us to not just do things because it's the quick click or the popular thing. Sometimes you've got to do the harder thing. But it only happens if everyone in this room stands up and supports journalism.
Please join me in thanking our panel.